Everybody, welcome to the session of Visions of Science and Religion in the 21st Century. My name is Tyler Volk. I am currently an emeritus professor at New York University. My departments were and are, in a sense, biology and environmental studies. I worked on the global carbon cycle, but I've been involved with systems that go all the way from physics to culture for a long time, interest in pattern formation at various scales. My entry into this group was via Greg's work for the Journal of Big History, which I read one of his papers, and we ended up being co-presenters in a couple of big history research group meetings, and then we ended up co-authoring a paper on levels and joint points for the Journal of Big History. So thanks all for attending, and thanks, Greg, for this invitation. I'm giving a very short introduction to the symposium, and I'm going to start by showing you one slide. Do you see it with Ken Baskin at the top there?
Yep.
Yes? Okay. So it's Visions of Science and Religion in the 21st Century. Our speakers are going to be Ken Baskin, who's been involved for a long time in the International Big History Association, with some interest in stories and the importance of stories, and also a large interest in religion. And his talk today is going to be Religion as a Neurobiological Imperative, and he put religion in quotes. And then there's Scott Jordan, who's a professor of psychology at Illinois State University. Title of his talk is going to be Wild Folklore, Learning to Understand and Practice Ourselves as Embodied Meaning. Finally, Bobby Azarian. He's a PhD in cognitive neuroscience, and I wrote down here the title of his excellent book, The Romance of Reality, and he'll be talking on cosmic teleology, a science-based religion for the meta-modern age. Just a couple of minutes of my own take on the science and religion issue, that gods and the formation of concepts in religion, particularly if you focus on gods, thinking of them as human concepts, and something I read of Greg's, he used the same word, God is a concept. Sounds like a song by some famous writer too. And but as Greg also said, which I agreed on, God has been particularly huge in human history. It's not just a concept, but it's been one of the big concepts that motivate people in various ways. And my bridge to the science is thinking of evolutionary processes that produce form and function that work in ecological, if we say that's broadly if we say there's human ecology as well, that these concepts are subject to cultural evolution's processes of propagation, variation, and selection. And thus the gods have evolved because as human constructs, they have been subject to those processes. And what we get is there are tree structures in the formation of religions. There are extinctions that happen. There are mutations and adaptations that happen. So I see religion as being analyzable in a cultural evolutionary perspective. And I put down at the bottom, the concept theories of sciences also evolve. Bobby Azarian likes to emphasize Karl Popper's work in this regard, that the models of science are subject to honing and evolution. And as a result, if we're going to speak about God, religion can be more broadly construed than having gods, but I point out on the lower left there is Greg's elephant sun god, and I won't go through his reasoning for icons that have formed this, but it's worth reading and talking about. On the lower right is an image from my book, Meta Patterns Across Space, Time, and Mind, in which I was looking at the occurrence of circles and spheres in the importance in various world cultures, including religions, as symbols of power or transcendence or sky or the other world. And I ended that chapter in my book with saying, what do we have today? And in the middle is something that's been, in a way, worshipped for ever since the Earth started being observed from space by a number of people. It helped spur the environmental ecology movement to some extent. The Earth itself is the sphere that we now can talk about as something sacred, let's say, if not a god, but a very different god from the gods in the past, as Greg's elephant sun god symbol is as well. It has specific reasoning behind it. So with no further ado, I'm going to stop my share. And if Ken Baskin could get ready, we are going to hear about religion as a neurobiological imperative. And welcome, Ken. You need to unmute.
Unmute first, yeah. First, I want to thank Greg and the team that put this on. I've been working on a radical reinterpretation of the behaviors we think of as religion for about a decade now. And this is an excellent audience to talk about it to. It can be very difficult because everyone knows and knows passionately what religion is. In many cases, whether they accept or reject it, it's part of their justification system. But everyone also agrees on one of the 300 or so definitions that exist. So it's a very confusing. And part of the response has been some very good scholars who say that religion is not a helpful category. I didn't agree. There's something about the combination of myth and ritual that is universal to the human experience. And so I set out to see if there was a way of, and I also noticed that with almost all of the definitions I'd read, from the perspective of the person making the definition, it made perfect sense. And so I wondered if there was a way of thinking about it that could bring everything together. The solution for me is what I call religioning, and I will flash the definition up on the for you. I define, I'm sorry, that didn't work, did it?
It came up first. It came up for a second, Ken.
Let me try that one more time. Okay, religioning is the process by which groups of people combine myth and ritual to understand and respond to the powerful, invisible, often mysterious forces that present their society's deepest challenges. And it's very much like it reflects what Bobby calls, I think he said it was the purpose of life, which is to gather information and compute solutions to existential challenges. And what Bard was talking about is the temporary stories that we use in order to be able to navigate life. What I noticed was that myth is an incredibly powerful force for shaping both individuals and groups. And I wanted to start with an example. Axial age, in the axial age, the main structures, the dominant structures throughout Eurasia were moving from relatively small kingdoms using bronze technology to vast empires using iron. And it created an enormous disruption. The situation in Greece was fascinating. There was a period of about 400 years where after the kingdoms broke down, there were no complex states. And what happened was about 700, you get Homer's epics written down, and you have this network of city-states. And it's just fascinating how much Homer's mythology is reflected in the structure. First of all, in Homer, you have a collection of independent states who fight like brothers and end up uniting when they're insulted by the enemy from the east, the Trojans. They join together, beat the Trojans, come back and start fighting like brothers again. And one of the fascinating things is that throughout it, the gods are presented as irrational and petty, but no one seems really bothered. Anyway, when you go to the Axial Age in Greece, you have these independent city-states that act very much like Homer's kingdoms, especially in the way Athens and Sparta act like feuding brothers. 490 and 480, they're invaded by the Persians, an enemy from the east. They come together, defeat the Persians, go back to fighting each other, culminating in the Peloponnesian Wars, which ends up exhausting the city-states and setting the stage for Alexander. Now, what's fascinating in terms of myth is this century was a terrifying century for the Greek people. It's not that different from what's going on in around the world today, the sense of uncertainty and devastation going on around people. And the members of the elite basically rewrote their myth. And so in the tragedies of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, you have these irrational gods causing incredible suffering for basically good people like Orestes and Iphigenia. This time, though, people aren't happy about it. There's a palpable sense of disillusion with the gods. As the turmoil continued, you got the philosophy of the mythic philosophy of Plato and Aristotle, drawing on the science of the Greeks to create what Jeremy Len has called a religion of rationality. And eventually that would spill over into Alexander's empire and then the Roman Empire. And similar things happened everywhere that had that kind of transformation. You get Western monotheism in Israel, you get Buddhism in India, you get Confucianism in China. And the whole discussion that goes on, Merlin Donald talks about how religion is debated and changed over generations. And that's what you see in the Axial Age until you got a new stable state. It was no longer the kingdoms, now it was empires. So what I learned from that was that this thing I'm calling religioning is a key driver of cultural evolution. And I wondered, why was myth so important? And what I came to realize is that myth is grounded in the neurobiology of perception. So when you perceive, your senses pull in fields of fragmented information. Your subconscious decodes it, compares it to memory, runs it by your mental models of how the world should be, and eventually delivers a coherent story-like model of what's happening to your consciousness as if this were actuality, so that you can make decisions. And there are three things that these stories have to do. First, they have to tell you what's happening. Second, they have to tell you how to respond. And third, they have to tell you why it's happening. And this came as a shock to me, because as I thought about it, what's happening on a social level has ended up translating very roughly, but roughly, into science. What should I do is philosophy. And why did it happen is what we think of as religion. And as I read, it was very interesting. Religion, science, and philosophy didn't emerge separately. They came up together. If you look at ancient Egypt, especially, with that rich tradition of science that let them build perfect pyramids, and the philosophy is very strong, and it all begins in myth. So this, I think, is what religioning is about. Religioning is about the way whole societies respond to existential challenges so that they can change and meet new challenges. And one of the things that happens is that myth incorporates the symbolic order of any society. Symbolic order is the way our minds evolved to experience the world symbolically. It's often considered the last mutation in the evolution of the brain. And Terence Deacon says it's what makes us unique. And what that allows is for any society to have a symbolic order that allows it to address its most important existential challenges. So in ancient Egypt, where their prosperity depended on the annual flooding and harvesting of the Nile, the symbolic order is around grain's cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. The great example is the myth of Horus and Horus, Isis, and Osiris. Osiris, who represents the abundance of the Nile, is murdered by his brother Seth, who represents chaos. Osiris' consort Isis, who represents fertility, magically revives him long enough to impregnate her with Horus, who becomes the protector of the abundance of the Nile. When Horus grows up, he has an ongoing, never-ending battle with Seth. And because Horus is connected to the Pharaoh, what this is actually teaching was that the Pharaoh's job is to continually battle the forces of chaos that a society like Egypt faces, where their prosperity depends on two relatively narrow strips of fertile land on either side of a river surrounded by vast deserts. And so my conclusion is that myths are not just stories of gods and goddesses. They're the way we evolved so that societies were able to understand and deal with their greatest challenges. I'd like to finish off by talking a little bit about why I think this is appropriate for UTOK to deal with. Our own symbolic order today, the clockwork universe, teaches us not to think of society as an integrated whole the way you had in pre-modern societies, but to think of it as a collection of distinct social institutions, each of which has its own myth. This is not a good thing. Take a look at what's happened with problems, our existential challenges like global warming. On one hand, you have the scientific myth that says that your purpose is to search for the truth. And when it comes to global warming, that's led to a half century of scientists warning about greenhouse gases, as opposed to the mythology of capitalism, which emerged from the Protestant ethic and its belief that wealth is a sign of God's favor, driving the leaders of capitalism to care almost only about making money. This is an issue we have to face, and if we're going to make the changes that we've started talking about, we have to face the fact that this sense of purpose and value that comes from myth has suffered the way Humpty Dumpty did. And one question we need to ask is how we're going to put Humpty Dumpty together again. In addition, religioning can help us with one possible explanation of how culture emerges from mind. That it's this need to tell stories, to understand the world, and work together to meet challenges that allows culture to work the way it does. So that's pretty much what I wanted to say. I look forward to your feedback. I'm uncomfortable with using the term religioning. I don't think it really quite does it, but I've never found anything else. And if you can think of anything, I would really appreciate it. Thank you.
Ken, great. Thanks a lot. From my point of view, you raised some really deep issues that I think will tie into the discussion quite well. So I thank you for that. We'll have lots of time, I plan, hopefully, to have questions and discussion at the end among everybody. But I think we'll move on to see all the talks first. And that brings us to Scott Jordan's talk called Wild Folklore, Learning to Understand and Practice Ourselves as Embodied Meaning. So, Scott.
I had to unmute myself. Sorry about that. Thank you very much. Delighted to be here once again. These images on this front page are important. One of the things I'm going to try to propose, one of the things I'm working on, is the idea that all of these things are fundamentally embodiments of context. Therefore, I'll work out how I think that comes to the idea of embodied aboutness, and then makes us naturally and necessarily meaningful. And this is an approach that's a little different from what we traditionally hear. So, first, I want to thank all of you for being here, and once again giving me the opportunity to be here. I'm a cognitive scientist by trade, a philosopher by passion. I also do a lot of work at Comic-Cons and in pop culture because I want to live what I'm calling wild systems theory. I want to bring it to people. I want to invite them to be part of it. And cosplaying Andy Dufresne may someday be what I do next. So things to admit up front, I absolutely love science, right? And I absolutely also love the taste of ice cream. Science currently makes assumptions about what we are that prevents the taste of ice cream from being necessarily real. And this is important to me. And this, of course, makes me very sad. But the problem is my sadness is just as unreal as the taste of ice cream. So the question I want to ask is, are there different ways to talk about reality that doesn't divide it into subjective, objective properties and therefore allows the taste of ice cream to be as real as cream, sugar, and bowls? So I'm going to argue that our models of what we are, what we believe we are, and what we believe we are living in necessarily contextualize and constrain our notions of what science is and what religion is. We can be spirits in a material world. We can be informational minds in a physical world. We can be physical minds in a physical world. We can also be quantum minds in a quantum world. What I'm going to talk about today is what happens if we think of ourselves as what I'll call self-sustaining energy transformation systems. Now, I won't be the first one to say this. There are other people speaking this way. Stuart Kaufman, I'll talk about a lot. Maturana Varela, the notion of autopoiesis. Rosen even talked about us in this way. Schrodinger talked about what is life years ago and talked about it as a thermodynamic process. So what I'm showing you is a wonderful painting as well as a mathematical illustration of Odom's notion that we live in a self-organizing energy transformation hierarchy. Self-organizing simply means there's nothing outside of reality that's coming into it, giving it instructions on what it should be like. What we have here is what emerges from what's here. Hierarchy simply means if you look at that lower left image where you have the circle on the outside that says low quality, that's just electromagnetic radiation from the sun that we basically get for free here on Earth. Once that energy source is available, I'll talk about how we have the emergence of systems we call plants, which I'll simply call embodied sunlight in the form of chemical energy. Once there's a plethora of embodied chemical energy, it affords the emergence of systems that sustain themselves on that. We call them herbivores. They give rise to a plethora of energy that allows the emergence of what we call carnivores. And of course, that eventually gives rise to the emergence of credit card companies. Now, that last comment may sound funny, but it's actually the kind of move that I'm trying to make, and to see your money as energy. First thing I want to notice is now I'm talking about what we are and what we're in as energy transformation, talking about ourselves as energy transformers, not physical mental systems. And that's the first major step I have to make. So Stuart Kauffman proposed an answer to the question, how does anything stay stable in a fluctuating energy transformation hierarchy? And he introduced the notion of autocatalysis, the idea that if you have A and B chemicals and they interact with each other, produce a product AB, if it turns out that that product is actually a catalyst for the AB reaction that produced it, then what you have is this self-sustaining system of work. So Kauffman then argues that living systems are basically self-metabolizing systems in that the work, i.e. the energy release that they engage in, gives rise to products within or outside of the system that nonetheless come back into the system and sustain work at some level. I take this notion of autocatalysis and I sort of transform it into the idea of self-sustaining work, because I think this can be scaled up phylogenetically in ways that I want to work on. But before we do all that, I want to talk about what is anticipation in a self-sustaining system. So I'm going to argue that the self-generating border, for example, the cell wall membrane of a single-celled organism, that membrane emerges from the work that constitutes it, while simultaneously constraining the transformational possibilities of its nested constitutive dynamics. What this means is that the cell wall comes from what the work of what the cell is, and which, first of all, there has to be there for there to be a system, a permeable membrane. Second of all, that membrane is perpetually constraining the transformational possibilities of the work that creates it. So the cell wall, in this sense, anticipates its nested transformational states. This is pretty much consistent with Rosen's notion of anticipatory systems. It pre-specifies, i.e. constrains, the work that produces it. So I'm going to argue that anticipation, what you want to call intentionality or whatever, is what I'll call prospective constraint. And anticipation, i.e. contextually emergent prospective constraint, is what self-sustaining systems are. So instead of anticipation and intentionality being something we do as physical systems that have some subjectivity, I'm going to argue that intentionality, that anticipation are aspects of what we are in terms of multiple scales of prospective constraint. These self-sustaining systems are necessarily embodiments of the context from which they emerge. So, for example, if you see the lion there chasing the zebra, or you see the zebra running away from the lion, the stripes in the zebra are about the visual system of the lion. And the neuromuscular architecture of the lion is necessarily about the dynamics of running zebras, as well as gravity, and as well as the context within which chasing zebras happen. So in short, I argue that organisms constitute embodiments of context, what Spinoza referred to as finitudes. If you remember, Spinoza argued that if God is infinite, then we are manifestations of God. But since we're finite, he called us finitudes as opposed to infinitudes. All right. Of course. Thus, these organisms, what we are naturally and necessarily about the contexts that we embody. Therefore, there's no epistemic divide between an organism and its context. My internal processes are naturally and necessarily meaningful because they are embodiments of context. They are naturally and necessarily about the context in which all this work has to happen. So organisms don't need to process information. They need to modulate the context they're in while simultaneously being modulated by that context. So the notion of self-sustaining embodied context avoids epistemic gaps, meaning, phenomenology, consciousness. These are all natural, necessary aboutness of which embodiments of context are constituted. In short, we are wild anticipation. We are what I'm going to call wild meaning. So it turns out that we're made up of a whole bunch of systems that function this way, and this has been known across science and different disciplines. Wild systems theory that I work on just actually sort of brings them together.
Hello.
Have taught us that neurons that fire. Someone needs to mute, by the way. I don't know who it is, but someone's in there. So Donald Hebb, 60 plus years ago, taught us that neurons that fire together wire together. What this means in terms of energy context is that when neurons engage in action potentials, that work simultaneously gives rise to retroactive processes in the nucleus of the neuron, which then gives rise to genetic transcription processes, which then gives rise to synapse formation. So the actual work, energy transformations of being a neuron sustains being a neuron. Jerry Edelman said very much the same thing for the development of neural networks from the age of 0 to 5. Our basic neural networks that we sustain are the ones that we use and work. Therefore, using them actually sustains them. B.F. Skinner actually said this with the notion of positive reinforcement. He just had a circular argument. Why does behavior happen again? Because it was reinforced. Well, how do you know it was reinforced? Because it happens again. The notion of self-sustaining work actually makes it clear. As this organism does the work of climbing up into a tree, doing the work to grab the apple, then doing the work to take a bite, doing the work to digest it, the chemicals that are released by eating the apple actually sustain all the systems that made the eating the apple possible in the first place. So Mark Bickert, over 20 years ago, made the case for this notion of nested recursive self-sustaining systems. What I've done was put it into wild systems theory so that it can address meaning, and I argue, come up with a way of describing what we're in that allows the taste of ice cream to be as real as cream, sugar, and the bowl. So each level of self-sustaining work constitutes a level of self-generated prospective constraint. My cells, my neural networks, and my organs are all systems of self-generated prospective constraint. So we're living in multi-scale anticipatory systems constantly is what we're constituted of. So the challenge is to show how we get from this sort of thing to the full-blown sort of phenomenologically drenched anticipations we use and humans have every day, and we tend to model with information processing theory. And basically, I think what happens over the course of evolution is that the distality of the self-sustaining context extends both in space and time. So it was Locke who argued that predators don't chase prey in terms of running to where they were. Predators chase prey in terms of propelling themselves as a whole through a gravity field toward where the rabbit or the prey will be. Now, how does this will be come to be? Well, one of the biggest findings in neuroscience, I'm going to argue, for the last 20 years is that every aspect of the cortex is actually thoroughly infiltrated by the cerebellum and recursive loops that allow us to embody the dynamics of our perceptions, the dynamics of our thoughts, the dynamics of our actions into the functioning of the brain. We take a lot of fMRI pictures of brain and we act like that's where our cortex, and we act like that's where the work's going on, but the data are quite clear. The instant that cortex is activated, it primes the cerebellum, and with 10 milliseconds, the cortex is being primed in terms of what has happened in those perceptions, those actions, those thoughts before. So right now I'm doing a whole lot of talking, moving a whole lot of hand stuff. I have no conscious clue how any of that's happening because I'm running on memory. So memory isn't just some separate thing. Memory is to some extent what we are. And then we find out that self-sustaining systems actually collectively create prospectively constraining external context. So when ants leave their nest in the morning, they go out, and what do ants do? Well, they generate and detect pheromone. Why do they go out in 360 degrees? Because they don't want to crawl on each other, and there's just too many of them, right? So as they lay down pheromone, we like to talk about that as signals. In wild systems theory, I want to argue what they're doing is transform context. And as they transform the context, they are actually transforming the prospective, they're actually actively transforming the context in which they exist and prospectively constraining the possibilities of all the ants that are in their group. Same thing with birds, but instead of generating chemical context, birds are generating auditory contexts. We called, again, a chirp a signal. I'd argue we don't have to call it a signal. We can just call birds generating collective chirp spaces. A female chickadee who hears her partner lose a verbal fight will copulate with the winner, even though she doesn't see either one during the fight. So the generation of these chirps actually creates a auditory context that prospectively constrains the actions of any given one bird. Much in the same way, the chemical gradient does the same for ants. So what we see is a scaling up of the type of energy that groups are actually generating and using to organize, i.e., constrain themselves. So now, as we continue to think about ourselves as extending the distality of our sustainment, I think we've got to the point where we can see ourselves as multi-scale systems of self-sustaining work, and we can think of intentionality and psychological phenomena as the generation of multi-scale prospective constraint. I'm going to propose that ants do it with pheromones and we do it with ideas. All right. And this idea of getting us to think of our ideas not as things that we think about and produce, but rather aspects of a self-organizing, self-sustaining energy transformation system is kind of what I'm after here. So here's a caveman. He goes out for the day. He's not successful. He says, I didn't catch anything, but I do feel I gained some valuable experience. Well, he's right. Because every time he goes out by the river, every time he goes to those mountains, those dynamics become embodied in how his body works, how his perceptions, actions, and cognitions work. And just like ants put pheromone in the world as a way of constraining each other, we put ideas into the world as a way of constraining each other. I want to call these wild narratives. This is the beginning of this idea of wild folklore, right? And why does it matter that we, dare I say, excrete aspects of our experiences into the world? Well, because it gets us a lot more energy per unit work when we collectively constrain each other with what we would call plans. So these externalized abstractions from our phenomenology create increasingly abstract developmental contexts. So think of the world that our kids are being raised in now versus the world that this gentleman's kids were raised in, right? And the developmental context that those different children were actually afforded the opportunity to embody. So we collectively create these prospective constructs, these prospectively constraining external contexts, and we can sort of see the evolution of transforming the external context in ways that increasingly allow our aboutness and our sustainment to be increasingly distal to the point of it becoming so hyper abstract that it's not about any one person. It's actually about all of us. So these external contexts that we live in have become unbelievably abstract. They become increasingly about the couplings we humans can potentially generate and sustain, yet they're not about a particular individual at all. We've been living in virtual reality longer than we think, right? Now, okay, that's all nice, but it turns out that one of the reasons we generate prospective constraints at all these different levels is so that we can actually be someone. And here's what I mean by this. I'm sure everybody in the room here has heard, the notion of mirror neurons, the idea that I perceive people with areas of my brain that I would also use to plan actions myself. Research with finches shows that when baby finch listens to daddy finch sing his song, what's activated in baby finch is parts of the brain that baby finch would use to create its own song. Okay, we know that. That's a mirror neuron story. The cool finding of this experiment was that once the baby's brain is embodied daddy's song to a point, the baby's own brain starts to inhibit dad's influence. That's not a conscious thing at all. And we ask ourselves, why would the brain go Hegelian all of a sudden and start developing self-other distinctions? And the reason is because if I'm going to resonate to another bird that's flying, I can't do exactly what that bird's doing. I've got to be able to separate my flapping from that bird's flapping to be able to flap in my context. So this ability, these, as I talked about earlier, these cerebellar cortical loops that continually prime our cortex with what to expect next, this creates what I'll call a background that allows us to foreground events in the world as stimuli. And it's an unconscious background that I study, but a lot of people don't, or when they do, they call it bias. Data indicate that these kind of, these sort of neurocortical cerebellar borders that we create and allow us to be someone are at work in the phenomenon we call schizophrenia. So people that have been diagnosed with schizophrenia are actually more able to tickle themselves than people who aren't diagnosed as schizophrenic. The data indicate it's because their cerebellar cortical loops don't work in ways like non-diagnosed people. So when you go to tickle yourself, you can't, because the minute you do this, your memories are priming your cortex with it's me doing this. This allows us to make the fundamental psychological distinction between system, non-system, between the self and not self. All right. And being able to do that allows us to do what you guys are doing right now. You guys have at least two thoughts in your head, the ones you're so kindly allowing me to put in there, and then your own, like, wow, check it out. I got two thoughts, right? That fundamental distinction between self, not self, is necessary for you to be someone. Now, this idea is not new. It's been in culture for a long time. If we look at Goethe's Faust, Act 1, with Faust in his dusty study, depressed and lamenting the fact that all of his rational knowledge still leaves him feeling disconnected from nature. And there's a bit here. And do you still ask yourself why your heart quivers in your chest? Why an undefinable pain steals all of your life strength? Instead of living nature where God placed humankind, you are surrounded in smoke and mold by decay and stagnation. So information processing theory, subjective, objective frameworks, they split the organism from the environment, and then we require something to bridge that gap. The contemporary concept is information to cross this epistemic gap so that organisms can represent and be about the environment. What I've been saying today is we are naturally and necessarily already about. All we have to do is manage ourselves in the context we're in. And what Faust is all about is the logical inability to cross the epistemic gap, which is what Hume taught us, generates despair. And that's what we see as one of the major 18th, 19th century responses to Hume's skepticism. A fantastic book.
Say, Scott, I'm sorry to interrupt, but just to give you a little alert about timing here.
Yeah. So you want me to be done in a minute, 2 minutes?
2 minutes would be great. Thank you.
Cool. I will be done in 2 minutes. Thank you very much. So in this fantastic book, Goethe, Nietzsche, and Wagner, the Spinozan Epics of Love and Power, this is exactly what Goethe was doing with Faust. Spinoza denied the existence of an epistemic gap between organisms and their environments. He conceptualized reality as God, as the infinite power of nature, and we are spatial-temporal aspects of God. Of course, he got him kicked out of the synagogue. But one of the major points of Faust is that this despair at being disconnected from living nature is the result of how we think about ourselves and how we think about what we live in. And his belief in an epistemic gap between himself and his reality left him in a state of despair. So his logically incoherent anticipations induced self-generated despair, and that's what Goethe is trying to tell us. I'm going to skip through a couple of these other things simply because I'm going out of time. I'll end today's story in the following way. We are and sustain ourselves within a collection of wild stories, multi-scale anticipatory contexts that contextually emerge from and are sustained within multiple nested levels of context. Due to our multi-scale resonance systems, we resonate with and are vulnerable to the multi-scale stories of others. That's why your parents say, don't hang around with that person, they're a bad influence. The self is a developmentally emergent story about embodied others. Our wild stories allow us to distinguish our own movements, perceptions, and thoughts from others, and allows us to be a relational self. From spirits to minds to entropy engines, our stories about what we are and what we live in have necessarily constrained what we perceive to be threats, risks, and disasters. We are wild folklore. And oh yeah, the taste of ice cream is definitely real. Thank you very much.
Great, Scott. Thanks. I love you're making me hungry for some ice cream soon, but I'm going to wait for a bit. Yeah, your idea of embodied context, I think, came through loud and clear. That seems very important to me in the relationship between systems and their environments. So thank you. Next, we'll bring up Bobby Azarian, author of The Romance of Reality, who's speaking today with the title Cosmic Teleology, a science-based religion for the metamodern age. Bobby, welcome.
Okay, had to unmute there. All right, thank you for having me. Thank you, Greg, for organizing this. I'll just say something about UTOK right here at the beginning. So UTOK thinks about the world in terms of these levels where you have matter, life, mind, and culture. And I think that's the right way to think about reality in terms of levels that are created by this multi-level process of self-organization. But in this talk, I'm going to try to convince you that the tree of knowledge in the UTOK framework is just a baby, and that tree is going to grow. Thanks for the introduction, Tyler. Tyler also does a lot of work on this topic. It's often described as big history, but I guess this talk will be more about big future. I think we can think about history and future at the same time. And thank you to Ken and Scott for those talks. I thought they were really interesting. And this kind of combines the two ideas, the one with religion and the one with self-organization and stories. So the title of this talk is Cosmic Teleology, a science-based religion for the metamodern age. Teleology, the term philosophers use to describe purpose or function or goals. And when you combine cosmic with that, you're talking about a universe that has some meaning or function or purpose and some end goal state that cosmic evolution is heading towards. And I think this provides a framework for what could be the religion of the future and a lens for interpreting past religions within this science-based framework. So just to quickly talk about what a religion is an example of a worldview. Of course, there are other examples of worldviews that are secular, like political ideologies, national identities. But a worldview is a system of beliefs and values that help an individual or group understand the world and their place in it. So they're adaptive. They have a function, and that's why they've stuck around. So at the individual level, terror management theory, popular social psychology theory, argues that worldviews were created when humans became aware of their mortality. There's this cognitive dissonance that's created by the fact that we know our life will end, but we have to get up in the morning and live life anyway. So worldviews mitigate this existential fear by instilling life with meaning, by making us feel connected to something larger than ourselves, something that will outlive the individual. So worldview is really a movement. But I want to propose another way of thinking about worldviews, and that's the perspective that they are strategies for collective survival. A lot of this kind of parallels with what Ken was talking about, where we make these myths to really survive as a collective. So it's adaptive. I also think that worldviews were necessary for the emergence of a society. So a human superorganism, the next level in this process of recursive emergence, was made possible by worldviews, and I'll provide some support for that on the next slide. They bind us together with common principles and practices, and they harmonize our collective activity. They provide a shared sense-making lens in a reality that's often chaotic and confusing, and they allow for the creation of civilization, which has this new level of causal power that we don't see with individuals. When individuals come together and form a civilization, they create all these wonderful things that we see that are the products of culture, like architecture and industry and technology. So Göbekli Tepe, some of the words are covered by the faces here, so I won't be able to read this exactly. But in 1995, archaeologists began to excavate a site in, I think it's Turkey, called Göbekli Tepe. And basically, they found these massive structures comparable to Stonehenge in size, and they were engraved with, I believe, like sort of mysterious-looking beings. And this excerpt is from the book *Sapiens*, and the author, Yuval Noah Harari, speculates that for a group of foragers and bands of tribes, because it didn't seem to be a civilization, there were no settlements or houses or daily activities, for them to be able to come together over thousands of years to complete this project must have required some sophisticated religious or ideological system that could sustain such efforts. So that's thousands of years before the first known civilization in Mesopotamia. And so I think it's good evidence that a worldview is probably required for the emergence of society and culture. So those are all those good things that worldviews can give humanity, but there's also a downside. So what binds us together under a common worldview is the same thing that can divide us. So people with the same worldview live in harmony, and people with different worldviews are going to be naturally in opposition to each other. So these cultures with different worldviews will behave like competing organisms. And if you subscribe to this idea of multi-level selection, then they actually are competing superorganisms with what would be equivalent to different DNA. So there's the competitive exclusion principle from ecology, which says two species occupying the same niche and competing for the same resources will try to drive each other to extinction. If one has some advantage, then it usually gets amplified and allows them to basically drive the other species out of the niche or to eliminate that species. And we can think of two cultures with different worldviews as pseudo-species. So a timely example is the Israel and Palestine conflict. And we see that we have people who are heads of state who have these kind of radical, strong ideological views where the leaders of both groups would, if they had the power, drive the other group completely out of the area or eliminate the group. So I think there's this great need for this unifying worldview, this system of beliefs and principles that we can all agree on. And I'm not saying that everybody needs to give up their worldviews or religion. I think that it's actually good to have that diversity of thought, but that these worldviews could be nested in a larger, more general worldview that could align common interest and allow us to try to solve the problem of these great existential threats we have, like potentially World War III, climate change, and now the threat that artificial intelligence could present. We must align interests because these problems are so big that they actually require the full computational power of the planetary scale superorganism. So that's really what merging cultures with different worldviews into one larger superorganism does. It really increases the computational power of the system because it becomes one large network with a common goal. So when there's a problem, as a scientist, I like to look to science for answers. But right now, the mainstream worldview of science is the reductionist worldview, and it doesn't really seem to provide any help with this. So it's kind of the worldview of the particle physicists, which tries to reduce wholes like living conscious beings to their component parts. So the way of looking at things sees the universe as this system of atoms that are following these blind mathematical trajectories. And in this position, life is usually viewed as something of an accident. So if you change something about the initial conditions, you might not have life at all. And the general view of this worldview is strict or hard determinism, which suggests that we have no free will or agency because, again, it sees the dynamics of the universe as just these particles following these mathematical trajectories. So there's really no room for human decision making or thought to have any causal power. And it generally sees life as transient and having no cosmic significance. So it's basically a nihilistic worldview. Says basically there's no meaning or intrinsic purpose to reality. So I am going to propose a paradigm that's basically the complete opposite of that as far as the philosophical and existential implications. And it's a pretty old worldview. We'll talk about that towards the end, different philosophers that saw kind of primitive form of this, like Hegel and later Teilhard de Chardin. But it's, I think, getting new support for science through this computational lens, this idea that the universe could be this learning machine or self-learning computer. So it's really, I don't think there's any difference as seeing the universe as a self-organizing system that's evolving into an organism compared to one that's evolving towards a computational system, because life is in some sense computational and doing information processing. So it's this process of recursive holonic emergence that really defines cosmic evolution. So it's not just this arbitrary evolution of this inanimate physical system. It's this process of multi-scale self-organization where nature's fundamental components come together to make larger systems, and those systems replicate and then come together to make even larger systems, which become the building blocks for the next level, and so on. So atoms come together to make molecules, which come together to make cells, which have come together on this planet to make multicellular organisms, which come together to make societies and ecosystems, and those systems have come together to make this planetary scale biosphere. And it seems that humans are creating something like this brain for the global superorganism. So in this view, life is not accidental or transient. It's basically seen as intrinsic to cosmic evolution and an inevitability. And so civilization and culture would also be an inevitable product of a self-organizing universe, and space travel hints at the future of this process. So we have to ask the really interesting question: is life, in some sense, destined to spread through the cosmos? And I think life is this incredibly resilient error correcting phenomenon. It's a system of complex adaptive systems. So we can think of it as a larger phenomenon that we can call adaptive complexity. And it's always learning. So it's always failing, but it's sort of like a chess playing AI program that starts off being terrible and keeps getting beat, but it continues to learn and store patterns and accumulate knowledge, and soon becomes unbeatable by even the best human chess player in the world. So where is this process going? I think it's a good hypothesis to believe that the inevitable future is this maximally complex integrated computational state Of course, some people might object to that and say, well, it seems like the universe is accelerating at an expanding rate. And with that, it's hard to see how life could spread through the entire cosmos and suffuse it with patterns of intelligence and knowledge. But it's interesting that, when you look at that problem and you look for an answer and you have this self-organizing universe theory, there seems to be always a solution that pops up. So there's a new theory that's popular in cosmology called quintessence, which actually argues that the accelerating expansion will begin to slow. So this is a quote from MIT's Seth Lloyd. He's a theoretical physicist, one of the pioneers of the field of quantum computation. He wrote a book called Programming the Universe. So he has this view of life as of the universe as being this computational system. And so he says, the digital revolution underway today is merely the latest in a long line of information processing revolutions stretching back through the development of language, the evolution of sex, and the creation of life to the beginning of the universe itself. Each revolution laid the groundwork for the next. The computational universe necessarily generates complexity. Life, the brain, and human civilization did not come about by mere accident. So you see this. This is actually from a different book. This is from Harvard astrophysicist Eric Chason's book, Cosmic Evolution. And it shows these different stages. And you see the emergence of stars and planets, but then you have chemistry and biology, and culture is building on that. So this isn't the traditional way that cosmic evolution is thought of. This has life and culture as being significant stages in that process. And again, that's similar to Greg's tree of knowledge, but then it has this future level. So I think this is a trajectory that's waiting to be filled in. And we're going to have emergent phenomena that we don't have the language to describe yet. So we're going to have to invent new words for whatever these next emergences are. Here's some data to support this increasing trend. So, of course, this cosmic evolutionary process supports the idea of inevitable progress. And really, in the 18th and 19th century, when people started looking at human history, sociologists, people like Herbert Spencer saw this, and it was the reigning idea of the 18th and 19th centuries was that human history was this story of progress. And of course, there are reversals in the trend. It's not this linear progression. There's these cycles of growth and collapse, but there's always knowledge accumulating in the biosphere. So you do get these trends like this. This comes from Ray Kurzweil's book, The Singularity is Near, and he maps out these canonical milestones, which are basically these paradigm shifts. And you see that technology is continuous with the evolution of biology and of the cosmos more largely, but you have these events like life's emergence, and you get the first eukaryotes and the Cambrian explosion, then the emergence of Homo sapiens, and then tools and things like the printing press. And they seem to follow this neat accelerating trend. And some people thought he might have cherry-picked these events, but then he took like 15 sources from like Encyclopedia Britannica and Carl Sagan's History of the Cosmos and found that all of the sources that mapped out these major events seem to fit into this nice accelerating trend. So here's a quote from a neuroscientist just to show you that this idea is supported by people in different fields who've kind of seen this picture from different angles. So as a neuroscientist, I've always been interested in consciousness. And here's Christoph Koch, who did some of the fundamental work with Francis Crick on consciousness. And this is from his book, Confessions of a Romantic Reductionist. And he says, the rise of sentient life within time's wide circuit was inevitable. Teilhard de Chardin is correct in his view that islands within the universe, if not the whole cosmos, are evolving toward ever greater complexity and self-knowledge. The laws of physics overwhelmingly favor the emergence of consciousness. The evidence from cosmology, biology, and history is compelling. And here's Kurzweil with a stronger statement. about the future. He says, it is clear that the physical laws of our universe are precisely what they need to be to allow for the evolution of increasing levels of order and complexity. Ultimately, the entire universe will become saturated with intelligence. This is the destiny of the universe. And he has this interesting image here, which he calls the 6 epochs of evolution. And he says evolution works through indirection. It creates a capability and then uses that capability to evolve the next stage. So we see at the beginning, we have physics and chemistry, and then DNA emerges with biology, and that's the source of encoding information. Then we have brains, so we have information and neural patterns. And then this epoch that we're in with technology, information, hardware, and software designs. And this epoch that we're on the verge of, where there's a merger between human intelligence and our technology. And right now, the advances in AI, I think, are impressing everyone. So it's really interesting to see that if you have this theory of progress and you went back, let's say 100 years, 200 years, and you made predictions, you try to have a theory of, what would we see if this were true? I think the internet and space travel and AI provide some pretty good evidence for this progressive nature of evolution. And so he sees the final epoch as being one where human intelligence spreads through the universe and starts to saturate the matter in its midst with intelligent processes and knowledge. And actually, this isn't something that humans have to choose to do. They have to do it as a necessity for thermodynamic reasons, because to sustain all this order, as Scott was talking about, you need to capture energy. You need energy continually flowing in the system. And with our star going to inevitably die, and we can also get energy from matter, the famous equation E equals mc squared. So there's plenty of energy out there, but if life wants to sustain itself indefinitely, and if it wants to keep progressing, it's going to look for more sources of energy for computation. So spreading through the universe isn't something that would be just this kind of choice that life decides at one point. It's going to become the main survival imperative for any future intelligences. So I think this has some pretty big philosophical and spiritual implications.
Bobby, can I just give you the
Sure.
2 minute friendly reminder here?
Okay. So it instills life with meaning and purpose. So it sees consciousness as central to reality, and it gives humans this existential responsibility to help the universe achieve self-awareness by spreading life. And we can only imagine the unimaginable creative potential of a cosmic mind. So it gives something, some sense of reverence that religion has had in the past. There seems to be this interesting compatibility of free will and cosmic destiny in the story, which is sort of a Christian doctrine, and we always wondered how that could be. But self-organizing systems actually harness randomness. The random fluctuations actually allow a self-organizing system to explore the state space, the space of all possible configurations. And so when you have some uncertainty at the basic level of nature, and you have systems that have cybernetic control, and then you have mental time travel allowed by our prefrontal cortex, we can see in the future, we can imagine different possibilities, and we can select from that menu of possibilities. Then we have true freedom, but you also have this cosmic destiny that's basically due to the fact that there's this survival imperative that life must spread. So life basically is forced to be part of this cosmic engineering process where it turns the substrate of the universe into computational machinery. And this evolutionary process also has this moral arc, it seems. So as we have a more developed theory of mind, and we can understand that others are beings like us with the capacity to experience joy and to suffer, then we naturally start to want to minimize suffering. So it's sort of this Christian concept of original sin, where life starts out as primitive and brutal, but it becomes more spiritual and empathetic as this cosmic evolutionary process goes on. So I mentioned Hegel and Chardin kind of saw this in a basic form, where the universe's struggle toward self-knowledge and freedom is kind of seen by this progressive increase that we see with the trajectory of human history. I won't talk about this much. I'll finish up right here, but basically you can look at this new story of a universe with meaning and purpose as one that could provide a framework for a meta-religion. So I mentioned those doctrines of Christianity, but we also have the concepts like yin and yang from Eastern philosophy, where you have this creative principle where opposite forces are interconnected and interdependent and create this self-perpetuating cycle. So order and chaos, or life and entropy, equals increasing complexity. You have Hegel's dialectical dynamic, which mirrors that. With Hinduism, you have samsara, which is basically this eternal recursive emergence. So you have life as being a series of cycles within cycles, endlessly repeating until liberation, which would be this omega point, this future state of maximum integration and complexity that the universe is presumably spiraling towards. And I think that could provide a project for people basically using this self-organizing paradigm, which we have all this evidence for, to map the world's religions onto this, to map those concepts on, and it would basically filter out the concepts that aren't consistent with, evidence-based knowledge, but would allow to retain the meaningful parts of religion that are consistent with science. And I think that could provide something like a unifying worldview, which would bring us together under one common goal, and that would be the continued persistence and spread of humanity. And wouldn't it be great if that led to global demilitarization and freeing up all those resources for things like health, medicine, and technology, life extension research? So yes, that is my vision for the meta-modern religion of the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Bobby. Wow, you set out some big aspirations here and big possibilities for us. When Greg set up this session, he said if I gave a short introduction, I could also have the first crack at the opening up the discussion. And I've been trying here to do some mind mapping on the talks and try to connect them in certain ways. And I'd like to make so here's my throwing out to the panelists to give maybe some short comments, if you like, before I open it up to everybody here. And I'll ask people to raise their hands. Ken brought up a really interesting example of the Egyptian, in which the myth and the power structure of the society were working with each other. We're very much coinciding, and I see that as a I guess that's going to be the core of what I'd like to open up here, because Scott is talking about the wild meaning, which could be thought of as a worldview of various kind that connects the biology and social and the self. And because Ken also talked about competing myths, capitalism and science, one looking for truth, one looking for money as competing myths. And that relates to Bobby's idea of competing worldviews that are in kind of an adaptive competition with each other, with exchanges of ideas, of course, but competing worldviews. So that relates to what Ken was talking about, competing myths. And you're all bringing up the need for some new myths that are coming, that the world needs. And this is part of the UTOK agenda in my interpretation too. I saw one of the questions, one of the texts there was saying there's also an idea called the third story. So if we look at Scott's wild meaning worldview and Bobby's recursive holonic emergence worldview, and in which the meta myth is subsuming and using the best parts of the current religions of society. My question, my issue, this is something that's on my mind a lot. How do these grow? These can be very abstract, and there's stuff that I'm totally into, but sometimes they seem like such a small number of people are that into it, and they're not really, it doesn't really engage with the power structures of the world, which successful religions through thousands of years are deeply embedded with the power structures of the world. And UTOK has this as a goal as well to make some serious changes in the world, which we all, I think, in this session see as needed. So, Bobby, Ken, and Scott, maybe just briefly, if you want, before we open it up to the audience, any thoughts on this issue of how these new ideas can engage with the power structures of the world?
I'll just be short. I don't think rationalism is a solution. I don't think that's where people live. I go to Comic-Cons, I cosplay, I do a YouTube channel because I want this energy in the world. And I think we have to encounter people where they live. And coming up with unified rational theory is not where they live. And it's not to their detriment that they don't live that way.
Thank you.
I think one thing about this idea that there's this self-organizing process that's going to lead to all these new discoveries is that it can appeal to those people because it introduces a new sort of mysticism. If you look back, if you imagine people 500 years ago looking at someone use a simple garage door opener, that would look like complete magic that violated the laws of physics. So we have so many things today, planes, humans going to the moon, that I think we can safely say that tomorrow's technology will bring things that are equivalent to magic and sort of use that to kind of seduce the people that naturally tend towards those more, supernatural beliefs and mythologies. But going back to what you were saying about power structures, I think what this new worldview could do and what it needs to do is challenge the power structures. And if we could have, so this new worldview would basically be based on systems thinking. So it would also have well-known principles that are used to optimize our human, social, and economic systems, and that could present the basis for like political ideology. And if you had, certain cosmologists there that or physicists who see this self-organizing story as maybe the better story to explain reality, and you had the thought leaders from science coming out and saying this should be considered a new scientific hypothesis, then I think that could start to pave the path for political movements that base designs for social and political systems based on systems thinking principles. And so if we could have systems thinking just take over politics, I think that would be the best thing for the world. Right
so far we have Scott saying we got to meet people right where they live. Bobby saying if scientists, which are already partly involved in the power structure, I'm interpreting here, we're coming forth with this new worldview, that would help start engaging the political systems. Interesting two comments, Ken. Anything?
The first thing is what we're doing here is theology. What will allow a new worldview to spread and take over is the cathedral stained glass windows. And I think that will emerge with time, because I think that what we're doing here is planting seeds. We're coming up with all kinds of wonderful ideas, and the more we talk about them, and the more we spread them around, the more possibilities they are. My fear is that the history suggests that you don't have a major change until there's a catastrophe that makes people say the old ways don't work. I think right now everyone knows that, and they're all acting terrified because they don't want to face that. But you have to get to a point where I think there has to be something. I'm afraid it'll be terrible that will happen, that will give people the reason to give up their old certainties and move on.
Okay, thank you. Let me move over and I'll see if people raise their hands. And Greg, do you want to say something at this point, but just about this current topic we are talking about? And then I'll ask for hands.
I would, folks. I've been jumping. I love the beginning, and then I wanted to catch the art. I just popped into the Portuguese. So actually, I just popped back to participate a little bit as I'm getting a slice of each of these wonderful presentations. So I won't make a comment right here. Thank you, though.
All right, I'll open it up, all three of you, into my comments. Made interesting comments. We heard Scott saying meet people where they are. Bobby saying get the scientists to say something about this world, the self-organizing worldview, and Ken give it time, but some fears that humans respond to emergencies. Emergence.
That's the key word. It's emergence and emergencies.
Yeah, that was Bucky Fuller, by the way. Emergence by emergency, one of his phrases. I don't know if you know that, but okay, it's open. Raise your hand. I think you'll pop up on my upper screen, and I'll give a few. Oh, yes, Steph McCurdy.
Yes. Hey. And hey, Bobby. Yeah, so I'm just pulling a few things together, and I kind of would just prefer some advice, I guess, which is, I guess I would have considered myself a techno-optimist, and maybe you've heard of the group of people that have labeled themselves the effective accelerationists a few years ago. Like pulling on some threads of the singularity is near and think about what technology wants, and a lot of the just really embracing technology. But and I sit at kind of the intersection of crypto and blockchain and LLMs in my work. And then I'm also a very big proponent of video games, and where hundreds of millions of kids connect with each other virtually. But I feel myself drawn a lot more at age 35 towards permaculture and like farming with friends and developing like a community that shares a sense of sacredness and spirituality that I'm only just realizing. And those two things feel like in the meta crisis space, or in these realms, like opposite ends, like super, like ultra tech solutions feel like there's a lot there for us, but also grounded, hands in the dirt types of living feels more like what my body needs. So I'm wondering what the panelists might say to some of those thoughts.
Yeah. So with the EAC movement, people see that and they think about the extreme version of that ideology, and they think of it as just this pro-growth thing, and that it's against these principles of sustainability. And you do see that completely as the opposite of the people who are more in touch with nature and these communities that talk about Gaia. And to me, it's strange that there's this war going on between the two communities, because for me, they've always been the same thing. And technology is a tool for becoming, more human and more spiritual. So I think we need to recognize this dialectical dynamic of Hegel, where whenever you have this thesis, it immediately creates this backlash and there's this antithesis. And from that, we need to recognize that both of those groups are going to have very good points. Growth can't just happen unchecked, because the system won't be able to sustain it. So there are going to be times where you have to think about how to slow growth in the short term so that you can grow in the future over the long term. And so I think when we think about worldviews, we got to always have in mind this dialectical dynamic where you're going to see truths to do two different sides and try to look at the dialogue and the debate that's going on and see how you can merge those two into a synthesis, which recognizes the concerns and the desires of each side. And that's, whether we're looking at how to try to unify the political right or the left or the religious world and the secular world. That's the approach we have to take.
I thought it was very interesting that you mentioned both permaculture and video games, because especially in terms of what Scott was saying, they seem wildly different. And yet, I agree with Bobby. This is a question. I mean, the question that we really need to ask is, how do we put Humpty Dumpty back together again? How do we create a sense that well, this is spaceship Earth. It's the only one we have. And if we're lucky, we may colonize space. But right now, we're facing some real hard things. And boy, the one thing that did occur to me was, I think video games are a fertile place for creating new mythology that people can really get involved in. So young people. So just wanted to mention that.
I'll just very quickly say that the energy transformation systems that make video games possible function with a different type of aboutness than biological systems, in the sense that when I consume food, when I put my hands in the earth and grow, all of the work I'm doing and all of the products I'm generating are essential to my integrity. In other words, this system can't be a system without that work. Whereas in the systems that we've created, the bits that are flipping in a computer do nothing to sustain the cabinet, the solder, anything else. So that difference transforms our aboutness. And the thing about AI is we have imbued it with our aboutness. It's kind of hallucinating in this bizarre Turing test that its aboutness is the same as ours. And I would argue it's not. And what it becomes, is going to be wild, and what it becomes. And I have to admit, I get concerned with notions of unifying worldviews. I do believe with Kenny's assertion that we will, once we're invaded as a unit, or once we're dying as a unit because of global warming, then there will be a worldview mythology that arises us versus whatever that is. But at the moment, we don't have a collective we.
Thank you.
I'll next give the talking stick to Brandon Casanelli.
Well, thank you. It turns out to be kind of thematic related to Steph's question. So I wrote it out, so pardon me for reading and looking down. So I wrote, I hate to appeal to less critical and long-form thinking, but I wonder if a bite-sized version of a UTOK would be helpful in reaching individuals whose attention is just rapaciously commoditized and yanked on every available second of the day, in order to kind of begin to spread this crucial information to more and more people. And the video game analogy was perfect. And this is probably appealing to the other clinicians in the room. Ryan, I saw your comment, and it's the cognitive dissonance is rising, cognitive overload is rising, distress tolerance seems to be falling in clients, at least in my experience as a clinician. And I don't know, maybe a shorter form, bite-sized version of it might be helpful just to open the door. Maybe it's already in the works, Greg, so I apologize if I'm jumping the shark there.
I'll let Greg come in too, but I think, yeah. So, well, I've got combogenesis, I say, wait a second, combogenesis. And then we're hearing tonight, recursive holonic emergence. And I mean, this stuff is food for my head, feed my head with this stuff. I love it. But I think you're talking about a different kind of bite-size message here. Is that right, Brandon?
Not knowing enough about the former terms, I don't want to comment further to clarify. I want to learn more before I respond to you, Tyler. Thank you, though.
Well, I will say, I mean, for me, built a big system, obviously very complex, hard to digest. And then what does it mean? And then how is that going to evolve ultimately? It's really where I am developmentally, and I'm so excited about this conference and other things. But certainly, to speak to an earlier question, my feeling is, well, my first question is, what's the worldview that people are operating from? And then an invitation to consider if it's holistic and coherent, and offer, if it's not holistic and coherent, then you're operating off of half a deck. And if you're pushing in particular ways in a tense time off of half a deck. And the analogy is, I do think we're sort of in a biplane heading into a hurricane. We want as much knowledge as possible to read all and have a sense about both what we are and what we ought to be cultivating. From a UTOK perspective, the idea, well, from a pragmatic perspective, how do you get it out there? I don't know. Obviously, I do things like ComMemo flashlights to try to consolidate elements. One of the things that I do, me and Masia do, that I actually maybe down the road will be significant, and I mentioned this, kind of frame ourselves as having a theory of the week, and that is Monday's void day, void darkness, Tuesday's energy information day, where the universe starts. Then we get matter object day on Wednesday, life organism day. Then we get mind animal day today, culture person day, and then God possibility day. And then the universe dies again on Monday and is reborn. I do think that we need to be thinking about these sort of framings, these value-based framings of us as energy information systems or energy systems. I know with Scott, or however, grabbing that, making that real. I was over, one of the things I jumped over to was the art element, Owen, Temple, and Faisal and Ethan. And that's another thing I'd hope for is the embodiment of story, the embodiment of poetry, the embodiment of song. So I guess to me, what my hope is that, yeah, this doesn't just stay systemically. It has to be metabolized. It's got to be embodied. Go to Benita Roy at some level. There are all sorts of different ways. And that's really my hope for the next decade is that the sensibility that we've gathered around, that other systems are gathering around, have a way to share that with larger and larger groups of individuals.
Yeah, I see that Greg is definitely headed in that direction, thinking in those terms. And I also wonder if I bring in Scott's wild meaning. We are wild meaning. If that could be, sort of expanded just a bit, but that's a very evocative terms. And I think Bobby's self-organizing universe that is like our body in some kind of way. The similarities of dynamical patterning between different levels, if that can be, and I know Bobby's working on it with his books and his blogging and things. So it seems that people are also concerned with spreading the message, not just sitting at home and being glad that they have some kind of new truth.
I'll just
go ahead.
Go ahead. I was just going to say that I think that's what we're all trying to do is figure out how to spread this message as far as possible and turn it into a meme. And Greg has, created art for this mythology. I think he's created a cryptocurrency. I think what would really do it would be like a big feature film, kind of the way Avatar just captured all of society with its story, or a video game or both. If people could really start turning this into a story like a mythology, the way we've talked about it today, and try to get it into pop culture with all those ways. And then what I think is going to happen, unfortunately, there is going to be a disaster, and that's going to cause the need for something. And until we have that, the meme's not really going to propagate at this global level. But if we have all that stuff in place, the solution's going to be sitting there waiting for us. So we need to plant the seeds, as Ken said, and I think that's what we're doing, but we need other people to think about, like, how can you get this to spread?
If I could just say, I think a lot of what we're talking about has been done in the world of art. Watch The Godfather, watch Shawshank Redemption. These movies are all about holistic collectivism. And people coming to that realization, people dying in the struggle for that realization. So art's been doing this for quite a long time. Look at David Bowie, and David Bowie sort of revealing to the world the contextually bound nature of identity. And how does he do that? He disrupts. So I think the idea of making a movie is totally on target, yet I don't know that it has to be explicitly a worldview. I'm a huge fan of anime. Yeah, it's out there, and they're telling these stories already. And I'll leave it there.
Well, Scott, but The Godfather is a lot about tribal warfare and murder, and that it sells really well. And in some sense, that's what we're trying to go beyond. I hope, and I think that we probably need to avoid some major disaster. We don't want tribal warfare to be the mythology.
Tyler, it's also like Biggie Small's first album, where he realizes that the only way he can be successful and get what he wants is to become a gangster, and he systematically destroys everything he loves. So, and that's what happens in The Godfather. But
so it's a learning lesson.
It's a learning lesson, yeah.
Okay.
Well, the thing is, it's a piece of art, and then we take from it what we take from it rationally. So some may say, Godfather, I'm a mafioso, that's my vibe. And some may say, this is a nerd will tell. So that's the thing about good art. It doesn't tell you what to do. It just does. And then we tell stories about it. And one of the traps we get into is our collections of words can never be the art itself. And so I'm just a big fan of really good creativity. And I think everything we're talking about's in there. And it's our job to maybe write papers and point it out.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right on. One of my favorite sayings, and I wish I could find who said it, is that life is neither good nor evil. It's just always surprising. And what we're doing here is finding things that, given the right, we're planting seeds so that, given the right conditions, something really beautiful can grow.
I would always also add, as a huge fan of Shakespeare, life is beautifully ugly. Slumdog Millionaire. There's never, you can never well, in my perspective, the inescapability of context is one of these things that drives our angst. And we solve that in the Western world by creating an acontextual space called heaven that we'll eventually get to and will absolve us of all the pains of contextuality. But if you're not going to despair, then the other option is to find a way to respect the fact that we can't escape contextuality. And you see Buddhism and such saying the way to be a good you is to be about others and joyfully embrace the sorrow that is life. So we start to see a different way of managing the suffering of existence versus trying to transcend it and get away from it.
Bobby brought up Carl Sagan, so I guess I would toss in his television Cosmos series here, in addition to his books. And how many, it's going to be millions, right? Tens of millions. How many have seen that? And that's probably as popular as some of the war movies. So that, I think that's very hopeful that something like a Cosmos series has the potential to. And I think it inspired a lot of teenagers, for example, who would see it on the web, if not the original TV show. So this is all being quite interesting about the power of art. I see one person in the chat said it's got to be beautiful too, in some kind of way. It has to engage people through. Well, that's the idea of engaging the emotions. And
Tyler, I have to say this literally, a little synergy, and we'll have to think about what this means. My brother just texted me a little thing. Actually, I think it's from Neil deGrasse Tyson's. We should probably reflect on the fact that there have been 3 seasons of Cosmos, but 20 seasons of the Kardashians. That just happened to pop up. So, we have some interesting waters to navigate in relationship to those facts.
That's pretty funny.
That was a moment of synchronicity.
Yeah, that's really odd, isn't it?
Well, one of the fascinating things about Hinduism is that the caste system didn't grow up as a power thing. It was a recognition that most people simply can't get the sophisticated religious ideas. It's only small groups. And so you have to recast it for what people can understand. And that's, I'm sorry if that sounds elitist, but I think it's accurate.
I'm with you 100%. I would say the same is true of Catholicism, in the sense that they were basically selling selling the opportunity to go to an acontextual space of non-suffering. People bought it and it kept the energy flowing in that system the way it did. I quickly want to mention that I was delighted to see Bobby mention Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva, because in Hinduism, what I call the ugly, beautiful nature of being is there. We are all Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva. We are all creators, maintainers, and destroyers. And if we're going to be entropy systems, what we need to come to grips with, which we deny in the West because of our commitment to an acontextual space where we don't generate any entropy, come to grips with our entropy-driven nature, and then find a way to respect ourselves as such, instead of trying to be pure, trying to pretend that we don't destroy. Every teacup we drink out of required the destruction of something. If we want to eat avocados, we've got to destroy thousands of ground squirrels and kill off some bees in order to have that orchard. But we don't talk about that when we talk about what we want and what's virtuous. And I think that's Shakespeare was telling this to us the whole time. It's a beautifully ugly mess. And, what are we going to do with that beautifully ugly mess?
We have to watch it. We have to watch the terms and develop new, great, beautiful, engaging terms. For example, in the complexity sciences, one of the terms I don't like is dissipative systems. Because it makes dissipative systems sound so great, and I always imagine a drunk, by the side of the curb when I hear dissipative systems. But I think we're getting close to closing here for all you dissipative systems.
Tyler, I've always thought that the language of complexity science is something that only the mother of a mathematician can love.
Okay. All hail the mothers of mathematicians, scientists, religioning. Do you have people? Ken, you like the word religioning. Is there a term for a person who is doing religioning? That probably gets to be a pretty long noun, but
human.
Well, with that, I think it's time to close and give people a chance to move on with the rest of their day wherever they are. And I thank you all for being here today, our participants, Scott, Bobby, and Ken, and everybody else who listened and chimed in and wrote the chat. So thank you. Let us carry on with the program.
Thank you,
everyone.
Thank you, Tyler.
It's a lot of fun.
Yeah, thanks, Tyler.
Welcome.
And Greg, thanks. This was a wonderful opportunity.
Thank you. It's been great. And we're halfway through. See folks that are able to come back tomorrow and pick this up. It's been a lovely day. Thank you so much. I'm awash in joy and hope. So that's good. And ugly beauty.
Greg, I have to be honest with you. I will be at a Comic-Con tomorrow all day talking about One Piece and such Eastern fables. So I won't be able to be here, but thanks to all of you for this amazing opportunity to chat.
Hey, man, I'm glad we were able to work it out so you could be here with us, Scott.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Scott, I would love some time to sit and talk. I love the way you embody interaction. It's something I knew, but never really thought about. It's a very powerful image.
I will put my email address in the chat, and I'd be happy to Zoom chat sometime.
Sure.
Just looking briefly through some of the chats I missed in the last few minutes.
I'll throw my Substack Road to Omega up there too. It's going to have everything I talked about today is there. Yeah.
All right. Thanks so much, guys. I got to run. Everyone have a great weekend.
Take care. Thanks
Bye-bye.
again. Thanks, Tyler. Thanks, Greg.